I'll record this lecture. Okay, I think we're working now. Can someone just quickly unmute your mic and just let me know if you can hear me and see the slides okay?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, perfect. Sorry about that snafu. The university made some changes to Zoom. I guess there were some people, not in this class obviously, but in other cities that were getting into Zoom meetings of businesses and companies and universities and hijacking the meeting and just causing a general disruption just for the purposes of that. So there's been a few changes to Zoom to prevent that from happening. So I think that was just a small glitch due to those changes. So we'll get started here. This is our last topic of the year. In some senses, it seems like it just flew by. And with this current pandemic, I don't know about you guys, but it seems this month's had 100 days in it. So we're at the end anyway. This is module 11. We'll discuss restorative justice today. This won't take the whole time. Embedded in this lecture, there's two videos. If you haven't read ahead, there's two videos. I'll leave you time at the end to watch those on your own. I would recommend watching those, wink, wink, with the final coming up. Probably a good idea to watch those two videos. So I am going to leave you some time. And they're short videos. One's 10 minutes and the other one's, I think, 8 minutes. So I will leave you some time at the end to watch those two videos as we work through this. Next class, which is in 2 days from now on Thursday, we will do a review for the final exam. And I did post on yesterday morning a review for the final exam. So have a look at those slides. So essentially you should have 3 reviews on UR courses. The first midterm review, the second midterm review, and the third reviews for the final. Just look at them all together. The final review only contains the information since the midterm number 2, okay? And I just seen a question there, Ivan, will this be on YouTube? Yes, I will post this to YouTube later today, so no worries there. Have a look at those 3 reviews. The final, we'll discuss, like I said, more on Thursday. It is cumulative. It will cover all the modules. However, it'll be heavily weighted on the material since midterm number 2. So that's module 10 on the criminal justice system and module 11 on restorative justice that we're going to cover today. So that's just a quick rundown. And that final will be written online a week Thursday. So that's April the 16th. Be written online. Now, you're probably having panic attacks from last time we tried to do this online. I have IT. The exam's done. It's ready to go. IT is looking at it right now to make sure there's no settings that'll give you that same error that you got last time you wrote the midterm. So hopefully there's no glitches this time. If for whatever reason there is a glitch, a problem, don't panic. We will fix it and I'll adjust your time accordingly. So there will be no problems. But to try and mitigate that from happening, IT's reviewing it right now. So hopefully there's no issues with the final. But we'll discuss that more next class when we review. But again, we'll write it a week Thursday on the 16th, 9 in the morning until noon. You get 3 hours to write it. It will not take you 3 hours to write it. So I wrote it last night myself. It took me 13 minutes. So I expect to take you longer than 13 minutes, but I'm thinking an hour and a half, 2 hours, probably somewhere in that range. And 3 hours is tons of time. So don't stress about this being a long final. It's not that. So we'll talk more about that next class. We'll get into today's lecture on restorative justice, which is module 11. I did put a few announcements up there regarding the COVID-19 grading options. The university has come up with a number of options that you can exercise. There's a flow chart I put on. It's right on our homepage, on our class page on the UR courses. It's very time sensitive, so I put that up on the weekend. Please look at it. If you haven't already, I hope you have. If you haven't, look at it today because there's a timeline that expires in one case on Thursday, so 2 days from now. So please, if you want to look at your different options, look at that flow chart. If you have questions about that flow chart, I put an email address and a phone number for Art Student Services. Make sure you call those folks and they will help you through what you should do. So again, very important. If you only do one thing today, please look at that flow chart and make sure you know what your options are because one of those options expires in 2 days. So make sure you have a look at that. And then just a note there about the final, I already discussed that. So we'll get right into it here. This first photo, so we're talking about restorative justice. And this first photo is from 1995 in Oklahoma City, where Tim McVeigh blew up a federal building. And that's quite the picture. It looks, it just took the whole front of the building off. Essentially, he had a large bomb in a truck, a rental truck parked outside the building, and he blew it up. And people died. I can't remember the number. I want to say 100 and some people died, almost 200, and hundreds were injured from the bomb exploding. In that building were obviously offices, people working for the government, as well as daycares. A lot of children were murdered when that bomb went off. So when we think about restorative justice, keep that picture in your head and ask yourself if restorative justice processes are appropriate in all cases, including something like this. Would a restorative justice process be appropriate when we discuss mass murder, obviously terrorism, where hundreds of people have been killed? Is it appropriate? And the initial reaction, I know, at least for me, is absolutely not. It's not appropriate. But as we go through this lecture, maybe your opinion will change. Maybe it won't change, and that's okay. But we'll discuss this a little bit more on a future slide here. So just a quick roadmap of where we're going today. We're going to discuss what is restorative justice. And I just abbreviated RJ, but just for shorthand. But what is restorative justice? We'll talk about the main components of restorative justice. Ethical practice is something that's very important when we discuss restorative justice, and you'll see why. I'll give you some examples of actual restorative justice in practice. So we'll talk about 5 different mechanisms for using restorative justice in practice, and also formal elements of the criminal justice system, as well as spontaneous acts by victims and victims' families. So as you'll see from today's lecture, restorative justice does not necessarily have to be a formal process orchestrated by the criminal justice system. In many cases, it can be a spontaneous act by victims and victims' families. So that's where we're going today. So from your textbook, restorative justice emerged in the 1980s in Canada. And kind of central here to this lecture is this quote here from page 404 in your textbook. If practiced and implemented correctly, that's key, if practiced and implemented correctly, restorative justice answers the central question, what is justice? And that is really what we've been getting at this whole term, this whole semester, is trying to identify what is justice. So if practiced and implemented correctly, restorative justice can answer that question. It is the restoration of relationships, which is another key word, relationships, and that's going to come up again as we go through this lecture. It is the restoration of relationships during and after a conflict. So, but bear in mind, relationships are never brought back to the original position that those relationships were in before. They're simply reset. So that is the crux of restorative justice. It's repairing relationships between people. And remember, restorative justice involves an offender, involves a victim, and it involves a community. So those 3 players are key in restorative justice. It involves procedural justice. Remember, that's just the procedures that are followed in a formal process. So procedural justice is important in restorative justice, as is substantive and distributive justice, as well as ethical practice. So those 3 things are going to come up here. And really what it comes down to is a mediation among the participants. And the participants, again, are usually the offender, the victim, and the community. Often there's a trained mediator that will sit in to help the negotiation and work through the process. So that's the key points to restorative justice. So I threw up a quick definition, a process, and there's that word process again, whereby all parties with a stake in a particular offense come together to resolve collectively how to deal with the aftermath of the offense and its implications for the future. That definition is a good definition. It's somewhat misleading in the fact that it talks about an offense. And what it means by offense there is a criminal offense. And as you'll see restorative justice it's not limited by the criminal justice system. Restorative justice can be utilized to deal with all sorts of different disputes and conflicts that are not criminal offenses. For example, schools can use restorative justice to deal with bullying, things like that. So that's kind of a narrow definition of restorative justice, but in general, it's a good one. And then I just put, we'll talk about 4 pillars here on the next slide, but there's a procedure for how to achieve justice, and that procedure is informed by ethical practice, and that should come clear here as we work through. So there's 4 main pillars of restorative justice. And first of all, embraces conflict resolution, okay? So the work is not delegated to professionals. Let's talk about comparing this to the criminal justice system. Whereas someone is a victim of a crime, they'll phone the police will attend to the scene, the police do the investigation, the police do the arrest. So essentially we're talking about the state there. The state is responsible for arresting. The person may be charged, and it goes to court where a bunch of lawyers, the Crown prosecution and the defense lawyers will do what they do in court. A judge will hear the case, and then the person is sentenced. It's always done by the state and defense lawyers and Crown prosecutors, and essentially the actual people involved are not really involved other than testifying in court. So the criminal justice system delegates all the work to others, whereas restorative justice does not delegate the work to others. It involves the actual victim. The offender plays a big role. The only person that maybe is a little bit delegated is, in some cases, the mediator, if there is a formal mediator. But again, it's not about the mediator at all. That person is there just to keep things moving and to assist with the process. But it's really about the involved persons, okay? So that's the first point. The second point is it recognizes social problems. So individual conflict is not solely interpersonal. It is situated in the broader community. We can look at drug use. There's an epidemic, obviously, we've discussed in class, of the youth's use of methamphetamine in the city of Regina. Regina is not the only city, but while it is a crime, perhaps that drug addiction is causing people to commit further crimes to feed that addiction. And that is not an individual problem per se. It is an individual problem for that person, but it's also much broader, much bigger. And I would view that as a social problem in the community where we live. So restorative justice recognizes that, okay? Point number 3, experience agency. And this is active participation. It's not just, like I said, testifying in court. Those affected by the situation are very active in its resolution. There's no judge handing down the sentence here. Everyone involved is very active as we work through the mediation, as you'll see in a coming slide. And the last part of this is engaging ethical practice. And I know you're going to get sick of hearing me say restorative justice is about repairing relationships, but that's exactly the crux of restorative justice. It's about repairing relationships. And because of that, let's see what's going on here. If this cuts out for some reason, I had a note that said the internet connection is unstable. I don't know what that means. It looks like it's full bars, but if something cuts out, just try and send me a note, but I'll try and monitor that. Anyway, back to relationships. Because it's about relationships, ethical practice is very, very important. So let's take an example from outside the criminal justice system and look at in a school, for instance. Maybe one student in a school is bullying another student, and the teacher is going to try and use restorative justice to mend that relationship. But in this particular example, the student being bullied is the son or daughter of the teacher. And so that teacher has a dog in the fight, so to speak. It is not fair for that teacher in that case to be the mediator in that restorative justice process, because the teacher has a stake. And because restorative justice is about building relationships and mending harm, that teacher should probably excuse him or herself and have another teacher act as the mediator in that case. Ethical practice is very important. The mediator should never ever have a stake in in mending that relationship. So in that case, the teacher has a relationship with one of those students more strongly than the other. So that's just a brief example of why ethical practice is so important. We don't want to do any further harm to the victim, and it's important to protect the most vulnerable people in that situation. So those are the 4 pillars of restorative justice. I'll just have a brief look here at the traditional justice system in Canada. So on the left there, you'll see some operating principles, and those include crime is a violation of the law and the state. So we already discussed that. The state is responsible for prosecuting criminal offenses. It's very adversarial. The justice system requires the state to determine blame, essentially guilt, and to impose pain. What does that mean? Maybe it's a financial fine, maybe it's imprisonment. That person is imprisoned away from their family, their friends, whatever the case may be. There's some sort of discomfort associated with determining blame. So financially, maybe that person can't afford to pay whatever the fine is. And so it's supposed to be a deterrent that changes behavior. And crime is an individual act. This is the view of the traditional justice system. Crime is an individual act with individual responsibility, and offenders get what they deserve in theory. So that's the operating principles of the traditional justice system in Canada. Let's compare that to restorative justice. So we'll look at its operating principles, which are: crime is a violation of people and relationships. There's that word again. It's very collaborative. Justice involves victims, offenders, and the community. There's those 3 groups again: victims, offenders, and the community members to put things right together. Not one blaming the other or 2 teaming up on one. It's all three together. Violations create obligations. So what does that mean? Essentially, the offender, having been the person who committed the violation or the offense or whatever the case may be, has an obligation to repair that harm. It places the obligation on the offender to repair that harm. Okay? As we already mentioned, crime has individual and social aspects, and we're not going to beat that to death too much longer, as we just discussed that. Punishment alone is not effective and disrupts the community harmony. Again, pulling someone from their job, from their family, from their friends, in the view of restorative justice is not effective. People obviously have different opinions on that, but that we're talking about restorative justice, and that is the crux of restorative justice. It disrupts the community harmony when we do that. And again, the victim has needs. So that's a key word. The victim has needs, and the offender has responsibility for repairing them. Again, the onus, it holds the offender accountable, I guess, is an easy way to say that. So here's just a few different petals, if you will, in this flower. And in the center of this diagram is making it right. It says putting it right. It focuses on, restorative justice focuses on the harm and needs. Well, not just of the victim, but of the offender. Perhaps there's an addiction issue with the offender. It really focuses on harm and the needs of the involved parties. It addresses the obligations, as we just spoke about, regarding what are the obligations for the offender to repair that harm. It involves the different stakeholders we've discussed, and it uses inclusive, collaborative processes. So again, very inclusive. No one is excluded from the process. It's not the accused person sitting in a prisoner box watching lawyers argue about what he or she did. So very different than the traditional criminal justice system process. Okay, we're going to move along into elements of restorative justice practice. And in bold print, think about ethical practice here. So at the individual level, the role and competence of the mediator is paramount. And we'll discuss some of the skills that the mediator should possess, but impartiality, which is what I spoke about regarding the bullying example in a school, impartiality is key. Listening skills, confidentiality is obviously very important. Creating no further harm is paramount. Validating the different people's needs, and providing consistent care and self-reflection are at the end there. So some challenges with restorative justice would be maintaining those things, maintaining impartiality, maintaining confidentiality. So those would be some challenges you could look at from that point of view. We talk about recovery, and we've already discussed this from a formal point of view where trauma can be put on the victim again when they're forced to talk about it. So one thing you may not be aware of is sometimes in restorative justice processes, one of the three groups, either the victim, the offender, or the community, does not want to participate. And that's a challenge. That is one challenge of restorative justice. And so sometimes there is a surrogate victim that will sit in for the victim and to allow that process to unfold. If that victim is not comfortable, maybe someone will sit in place of that victim and allow the process to play out that way. At the community level, the criminal act is seen as an imbalance in the community. Okay, it's not necessarily an individual problem, but it's seen as an imbalance in the community. We talk about the unraveling of the cloth of the community. It's bigger than just the individual problem. Here's just a Venn diagram. You can kind of go through this on your own, but it's just it talks about victim, the community, and the offender are your orange circles, the big ones. And as you work towards the middle, we see some restorative justice processes in the middle. So I'll let you have a look at that. And a couple of just points here. Certain needs we might not think about regarding needs of the victim's family members, for instance. So one thing is, maybe being able to speak with the offender is important. And in one of the videos I'll let you watch later, the link will be coming up. Just keep that one in the back of your mind when you're watching that video. It's called The Wolf Within, and quite a good video on restorative justice. Mental health assistance, again, very prevalent in that video. And it's one thing to hear me rambling on about these things, but it's another thing to see someone who actually went through this and think about those two in particular, being able to speak with the offender and the mental health of the victim being addressed, very important. And obviously safety is key. Being able to do that in a safe environment is paramount to a restorative justice process. Something else that pops up is the needs of the offender's family members. Perhaps they're looking for some mental health assistance for the offender. Maybe it's important for them to express sorrow over the crime or the offense that's been committed. At the center of all of these needs, of course, is the actual story. And from that story comes these different spokes. So when the offender's talking about why they did what they did, these different spokes will pop up. Same thing with the victim. In that video, The Wolf Within, the story of the victim, being able to hear the victim's story and how an offense has affected them is sometimes all the offender needs to really turn their life around and not think about committing the same offense. But again, that video is quite a powerful video, and it does a really good job of explaining these different needs that the different wheels, if you will, of restorative justice might need. So some needs of the actual offender here on this chart. A safe place to tell their story. This is not obviously maybe someone's committing the crime because of a drug addiction. There's obviously a drug-free environment. Competent legal aid is available. In often cases, restorative justice processes occur before a trial. So we're talking about pre-charge, a pre-trial measure. So they haven't gone to trial yet. They haven't seen a judge. Sometimes restorative justice processes run concurrently with official criminal justice trial. So keep that in mind. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive. So sometimes lawyers are involved in this process, but not generally. So we talk about the four different needs of the offender: their safety, treatment, accountability, and family. So you can read through those there. Now, we're going to talk about some challenges associated with restorative justice processes. One main challenge is changing the lens. And what do I mean by that? So a lot of people who push for harsh punishments and really people getting what they deserve have a tough time viewing restorative justice processes as a legitimate mode for dealing with a criminal offense. Sometimes it's viewed as being soft on crime, in quotation marks, if you will. So changing that, excuse me, changing that lens is certainly a challenge with the restorative justice processes. Another challenge is what to do when victims and offenders do not want to participate. So in the case of victims, like we already talked about this, sometimes a surrogate victim will sit in for the actual victim. Oftentimes, if the offender does not want to participate, often simply it'll go back to the traditional criminal justice system. If the offender is not wanting to participate in the process, the offense will be dealt with in the traditional criminal justice system. But in the case of the victim, not wanting to re-victimize the person is obviously important. So sometimes we can have surrogate victims sit in for the actual victim. Another challenge is maintaining confidentiality of the parties. So it's not okay for the mediator to go out for dinner that night and start talking about the process with his or her friends. Confidentiality of the parties is important because these people are really opening up in these mediation processes, and a lot of personal information is going to come out. Again, maybe they have no money, maybe they have a drug addiction, family problems, domestic violence is maybe played a factor in their committing of the crime. So confidentiality is key. And also another big one there, avoiding harm and shaming of the offenders. The goal is not to shame offenders. That is a key point. Maybe it will come up on a final exam, I don't know. But really know that point. The goal is not to shame offenders. The goal is to hold them accountable. The goal is to get them help. The goal is to include them in the process. But at the end of the day, we want everyone to feel as if they won. The victim got what they wanted. The offender has taken responsibility and repaired that relationship with the victim. The goal is not to shame offenders. So know that point. Restorative justice recognizes that conflict is inevitable in all societies. There's no society in the world that exists that does not have conflict, and restorative justice recognizes that. It also recognizes or requires at a minimum that we address the victim's harms and needs. Those are two very important points, and holding offenders accountable is the key to restorative justice. So harms and needs and holding offenders accountable is what I would take out of that slide there. So this video is, the first one is 10 minutes long. It's called The Wolf Within. We're not going to watch it on here. I'll give you time at the end to watch it. I would highly recommend you do watch it. It does really put things in perspective when you can see an actual victim of crime and the offender, and they discuss I'm not going to say too much more than that. It's 10 minutes long, but just have a look at that when you have a moment. Just a quick note. Prior to colonization, traditional Aboriginal justice really resembles restorative justice, what we're looking at with restorative justice today. There's both a formal part and a spontaneous examples in restorative justice, and restorative justice focuses heavily on relationships. Thus, strong ethical practice skills are required. That's a key point. Restorative justice focuses heavily on relationships, and thus strong ethical practice skills are required. Important point. Okay, we're going to get into conflict resolution skills. So these are some skills that people working in conflict resolution Dispute mediation, restorative justice processes should possess active listening. So not just sitting there and taking it in, but actually actively listening to what each person is saying. Avoiding a win and loss framing. Again, as I mentioned on the previous slide, it's not about winning or losing. No one should lose in this situation. Everyone is coming together to repair that relationship. So in the case of a criminal justice trial, when someone is convicted, obviously the Crown prosecutor wins, if you will. The state wins, the defendant loses, and they're going to lose whatever it is, time, money, criminal record, maybe restrictions on traveling, whatever the case is. It's a very adversarial process where someone does win and someone does lose in every situation. We want to avoid the power trap. So if the victim and the offender do not come from the same place, there could be a very large power differential between the two, and that's important to acknowledge. It's a separate problem from the person. So what I mean by that is the problem does not dictate who the person is. They've committed an act. We don't label them as, say, if they stole something, they're not labeled as a thief. What they did is they committed theft, but that person is not necessarily labeled as a thief. They should not be labeled as a thief. It's important to separate the person from the problem. Impartiality. We talk about family violence. This can be tough. Also in the bullying example in the schools, if we're using restorative justice to discuss a family violence issue, impartiality is very difficult in that situation if everyone is from the same family. So it's important to be impartial. The mediator really has to be impartial in those situations. And again, we're looking to identify needs of all three parties, the offender, the victim, and the community, and we're looking for a solution to repair that relationship. That is the goal at the end of this. We'll look at some relationship building principles. So the realities of the people involved might be very separate. Maybe they obviously will come from different places. When they leave that mediation, they're going home to different homes. Different realities exist in those homes, whether it's violence, substance abuse, whatever the case may be. They're coming from different places. So what's important is we try to understand the other person's view of the world. Where are they coming from? How their experiences got them to this point. So it's important to put ourselves in the other person's shoes. It's also important to recognize that we can't control others. We only control ourselves. So that is a key theme to most mediations, where we are responsible for our own actions. And we recognize the fact that we can't control others. Again, collaboration and consensus is, we're trying to create a new option here. Maybe one that wasn't available to the offender prior. So maybe they didn't see a way out, or they didn't see an alternative to stealing that car. We're trying to create a new option, and while maximizing degrees of freedom. And again, at the bottom, win-win mental model. So it's a win-win. We want everyone to win at the end. The offender gets what he or she needs, the victim is satisfied, and the community fabric has been repaired. So we don't, again, not a win-lose situation. Okay, 5 mechanisms of restorative justice in practice. So for your final, I would probably have a good read of these, at least be able to list these mechanisms, and just briefly, maybe you should understand what they are. So hint, hint, know what these mechanisms are. There's 5 of them of restorative justice actually in practice, okay? So we'll talk about the first one here, which is simply victim-offender mediation and a dialogue, which is just a meeting between the victim and the offender, involves a trained mediator, and the goal is to resolve the dispute together. I put 3 objectives up there: identifying what the injustice is, what is the harm that's been caused, to try and make things right is the second one, and then considering future action is the third. So mechanism 1, if you wanted to list that off on an exam, you would say it's victim-offender mediation and dialogue. And then the bullets below will just describe what that is. Again, just a meeting between the victim and the offender with a mediator. So that's the first mechanism. Second mechanism is family group conferencing. And from your textbook, discusses this beginning in New Zealand, involves a facilitator again. The victim and the offender and the families all meet together. Procedural justice occurs. There's a process that plays out with the mediator. The group is empowered to develop their own outcome. Again, this is a family group conferencing. So at the end of this conference, that family's leaving there together. And so it's important that they develop their own outcome that's going to work for them to repair whatever harm has been caused. So that's the second mechanism, simply a family group conferencing, a family coming together. Third mechanism, justice circles. So this is derived from Aboriginal peacemaking practices in North America. It involves a facilitator, again, the victim, offender, and in this case, family, friends, and community members all come together, and involves using a talking stick, and only one person speaks at a time during this mediation. So whoever has a talking stick has the floor, so to speak. And there was an example in your textbook from just outside of Calgary, so a local example. That's the third mechanism, justice circles. And the fourth one here, victim impact panels. So surrogate encounter, this is a surrogate encounter. This does not involve an actual victim. What we have here is groups of unrelated victims and offenders in the room together looking for a resolution. And it exposes offenders to the damage they have caused. And this is often used in conjunction with traditional criminal justice programs. I've been a part of this myself before. Some examples where this is used is, for instance, impaired driving. And another one is prostitution offenses. So I sat in on one that involved prostitution offenses. And essentially, we have the offender sitting in a room, and people who are not necessarily the victim, but I'm talking about parents of people who have worked in the sex trade, discuss, in some cases, very personal things with respect to their family members working as prostitutes, being murdered, beaten, stabbed, the dangers that go in are involved with business of prostitution. And the offenders hear from these surrogate victims, if you will, these people whose lives have been affected by these people that are sitting in the room purchasing sex from the prostitutes. So that is one example I've been involved with, just watching. It was quite powerful. Another example, as I mentioned, impaired driving. You get a group of people together who have lost family members to impaired driving. Maybe they were killed in a motor vehicle collision where an impaired driver had hit them. And so these people that are charged with impaired driving get to hear from actual people who have been affected by the offense of impaired driving. Again, it's a surrogate. It's not the actual victim here, but the offender gets to hear from people whose lives have been changed because of the offense. So quite a powerful thing, the victim impact panels. That's the way that works. So that is the fourth mechanism. And the fifth mechanism is victim outreach specialist. And this is a defense-initiated victim outreach. And at the beginning, when I showed you that photograph of the federal building that Timothy McVeigh blew up, this was actually used, excuse me, in that trial. And so it really focuses on the needs of the victims, and it builds a bridge between the defense and the victim. And what happened in the Tim McVeigh trial is the defense lawyers wanted to build a relationship with the victims, people that were affected by that explosion. And so they did outreach and mediation between the defense team and the victims. And you would think, well, that restorative justice has no place in a terrorist bombing like that. But in this case, it was used. And positive results, obviously, from some of the victims. There obviously are challenges associated with the defense team. They're representing this mass murderer, Tim McVeigh, who was ultimately sentenced, convicted, and received the death penalty for that. However, some victims did find it beneficial. Others had no interest in discussing it with this team of lawyers who's representing this murderer. So mixed reviews on this one, but that it is a thing, and it does happen. It did happen in this particular case. So kind of interesting. Those are the 5 mechanisms. Make sure you know the names of each of the 5. There's others out there. There's not only 5, but these are 5 mechanisms I put together, actual restorative justice processes that are taking place today. So just be able to list those 5 off and have a basic understanding of what each mechanism is. I'll move along here. Just another, this is just an example of restorative justice in a school setting, and we discussed this already. We're not going to harp on this for too long, but you can give that a read through on your own time. We'll get into some impacts of restorative justice. About 45 minutes in or so, we're almost through restorative justice. So I promised I would leave you time at the end to watch those 2 videos, and I will. So we'll just get through these last few slides here. We'll discuss impacts of restorative justice. So I would know this slide as well. If we're going to discuss restorative justice, I would know why are we studying this in the first place, and here are some of the impacts. So when we look at restorative justice, proponents believe community engagement increases. So when the community has a stake, a dog in the fight, so to speak, their engagement in the process increases. There's a reduction in negative behavior. So it can be in schools. In the example of bullying, statistics show using restorative justice will reduce negative behavior, whether that's bullying. There's a reduction in suspensions that are handed out to people. Also, in more formal processes, there's a reduction in crime, if we look at it from that point of view. Regarding the criminal justice system, when incarceration is supposed to be the deterrence, there's minimal impact. So when you look at incarceration as a deterrent, the crime rate doesn't go up, it doesn't go down. There's very minimal impact when that is the only deterrence, because essentially some people believe that most crimes are an act of passion. They don't think through what the punishment will be before they steal that car, before they commit that armed robbery. They're committing that armed robbery maybe to get money to buy drugs, whatever the case is. So incarceration as a deterrence has a minimal impact. That's an important note. Also, the costs associated. We talk about one of the reasons people are sentenced to jail is to essentially take them out of society so they cannot commit further offenses. Well, depending on which study you read, this one says $250,000 per person per year. Another one I read was somewhere around $150,000. The actual number is not that important, but when we remove prison from the equation, it saves all of that money. So there's a substantial savings financially to the criminal justice system when prison is not on the table as a sentence. So that's another impact. Another impact listed there, I said, it reduces the pipeline to a criminal subculture in prisons. And all that states, all that means is when someone goes to prison, if they haven't already been exposed to, say, gang life or the criminal element, if you will, they are going to be exposed to that in the prison. And in some cases, gangs will use the prison to recruit other gang members. So if they weren't in a gang when they went in, maybe they will when they come out. So it just removes that exposure. So those are the main impacts. Again, increasing community engagement. That's a big one. Reducing negative behavior. The incarceration, when it's used as a deterrence, does not have a big impact on the crime rate. It reduces costs to the criminal justice system, and the fifth one there, it reduces exposure to the criminal element in prison. So I would be familiar with that slide there. Now, lastly, all these mechanisms we've discussed are formal responses within the criminal justice system. I put up a few programs that are run by nonprofit organizations right here in Saskatchewan. You can read those through on your own. there is, as we mentioned in a previous slide, non-formal responses, or spontaneous is the word I use, spontaneous responses to a harm. And those spontaneous examples are found. There's one that's found on this last video here, and it's only 8 minutes long, but I would have a watch of this video for an example, a really good example of a spontaneous action that occurs outside the criminal justice system. We talked about the formal ones. This is an informal one. The example in this video was not put in place by any formal process or by any court system. It's about a young man, as a boy, who's 14, who shot and killed a pizza delivery driver in San Diego. I followed up on this story, and he was sentenced. He was 25 years he did. So he was 14. I believe he just got out of jail in 2018, if I recall. But he did actually serve 25 years. And you think about that 25 years of his life from 14 and on, that's quite an important part of his life that he missed. So have a look at this. But this is a good example of a spontaneous action. I just had a note here on the side. Will the final exam cover everything from the beginning of the semester? Yes. Yes, it will. As I mentioned, we'll discuss this more on Thursday. But the most heavily weighted portion of the final exam will be these last two modules, since we've been studying since midterm number 2. However, it is cumulative. It will cover the entire semester, but we'll discuss that a little bit more on Thursday. The short answer is yes. Yes, it will cover the whole semester. That is the last video, the last slide I have for this restorative justice. So I'll post this online to YouTube, and I'll share the link on our page. A reminder, please go and look at that COVID-19 grading option slide I put up on our class page. It's very important that you know what your options are. There's 4 different options on there, and this has not happened before. So as I mentioned, one of those options, I believe it's the withdrawal option. It has a timeline that's due in 2 days. So if you're looking to exercise that option, you need to take action in the next day or 2. So please go find that. If you can't find that, it's right at the top. It just says COVID-19 grading options. Please email me if you are unable to locate it. It's very important that you look at that today. And again, these 2 videos, please watch them, as I will ask you some questions about these 2 videos on the final. So they're very short. One's 10 minutes and this last one is 8. And they do a really good job of giving you a real world example of restorative justice in action. So please have a look at that. I think we'll leave it at that for today. As always, I'm available on email. If you require any assistance, we can set up a private Zoom chat, or we can go back and forth on email to clarify any points that are not clear to you. So I thank you very much again for tuning in at this time. We have one more class on Thursday where we'll do the final exam review, and then we'll write the final exam online a week Thursday on April 16th in the morning. Thank you again for your time, and we'll chat with you in 2 days.